I made this node that allows you to unwrap objects in, well, manually unwrap objects in Blender. So here there are some nodes to mark the seams. Here there are some nodes to position the different objects onto the UV space. And then finally you reassemble the node and you get your object, which is, properly textured. So everything will be in the description. I'll put everything on GitHub. So if anybody would like to experiment with those nodes, they can. So basically I started with an object that comes out of here, but let's say if you wanted to start with some other object, let's say you wanted to start with a cube or something, you could just connect any object here. But I spent some time to make a leaf, so I'll be using that. So before marking the seams, usually I take the capture attribute node and then I capture the position, so the vector on every point of the mesh, because we'll need it later to reassemble the object. Yeah, the mic is on. So in this node I can select the different pieces I want to separate with the grids. So here I have a few grids. Wait, let me go into this. Okay. So here I have here I have basically two grids here. It's a bit hard to see because they're so thin. But basically I'm separating my initial object, which is the leaf, with those two grids. So basically what happens is that if the grids are next to the object, it will separate, the first face, the intermediate, mesh, and then the last face here. So I have basically my three faces separated with this node, and I can translate, the different. I can translate the grids. I can put this more. I can put this higher, for example. And then I wouldn't get the same objects selected. So I'm basically selecting the different parts of the mesh that I want to separate with those grids. So this is one grid, this is the other one. So with the first grid I have these three nodes. These three inputs here. So I have the translation, so where I want to put the grid on each axis, and then I have two rotations. The reason I chose two is because sometimes there is gimbal lock. Normally you can do this with only one rotation, but if there's some problem, you can use two. So for example, here I'm rotating by 90, and then let's say I want to rotate this on the z-axis by some amount. At least I won't get gimbal lock if I have two inputs. And then what's at the bottom is basically for the other grid. So I have 3 and 3 here, so for the two grids. And then the last input is the the distance that will select the edges. So with the geometry proximity node, I'm basically selecting the edges I want to mark, and then separating the different parts of the mesh basically. So this is for the first node, and well, as you can see, I've increased the size of the grid. Well, I've increased the position of the first grid, so it is not selecting the entire leaf. There's this part at the bottom that's missing. So let me decrease this again so that I get my my object separated properly. I think that was the initial setup. So here this node, basically with this node I can get for example this first object which I have to put in this node, the light blue node, which I call UV placer. I can also take the other this side of the leaf. So there are two sides of the leaf. So one side I plug it in here, the other side I plugged it in here. So those are the two sides of the leaf. The third one I decided to because it's not separated still entirely, like this is still connected everywhere here, I use basically another node here to just cut out the top portion. which you can see here. So I cut the top portion. This is the same thing than this node, but we're just using a, you know, some object I created here, you know, some object I created here, and that is what marks the seams basically to separate the object. So you can, for example, extrude some vertices, let's say on the x-axis, you know, then extrude on the z-axis, and you can, well, just build any objects you want to mark the seams here, and then you can use the node that I used previously. So let me come back to my setup here. And basically with this second node I can have my object here separated, at least on the top. Once it's separated, I can use another node here, the unwrapping node. So basically any object that looks like, you know, that basically looks slightly like a box, I can unwrap with this node here. So before I use this, although I have to say here, usually the object should be above the origin. So this is what I've done here, just between the two nodes. So I've taken my object here that I want to separate. No, that's already separated here, which is the third socket from this node here. And if I were to just use this, it wouldn't really work very well. So because it's, you know, part of the mesh is underneath the, you know, the plane here. So you have to increase the height a little bit so that this node works here. Then when your object is centered around the world and is, you know, above the plane, the XY plane, you can use this node here, and this will unwrap, you know, your object. As long as it more or less looks like a cube. So it has four faces, a top face and the bottom face. In our case here, the top face is missing because I just removed it just for simplicity's sake, but you could have a top face also and it should normally work. So the way that I use this is, so for this to work, it has to understand which face is the right, the left, the front, and the back face of the box, basically, that you're trying to unwrap. So here I've marked that the right face is any face of our original object here. Right is any face that has a normal that's basically pointing in the x direction. So our x direction is here. So any face that has a normal, well, where the normal is where the face is pointing. So if it's pointing in the x direction, it will be considered as a right face, as the right side of the box, basically. Here we don't have any faces pointing in the right direction, so it makes no, you know, difference whatever I put in here. But if I were to put 1, basically it has to be a face that's precisely pointing in the x direction. It cannot even be, you know, pointing anywhere else. But if you lower this value, you can basically point it, you know, this is not pointing exactly in the x direction, but somewhat, you know. And then if you, you know, the closer you are to 0, the more it can, you know, point in other direction, but it still has to have some x direction. So it still has to point somehow in the, like a little bit in the x direction still. So for example, so in our example here, we don't have any right and left faces. So here it makes no difference what I put in here. But for example, if I were to change those values here, so this is to select the backwards face of the box. So anything basically pointing in that direction would be the backwards face. And so here, if I were to, you know, increase this a lot, it wouldn't unwrap my object properly here. So here it still seems okay, but if I keep increasing it, yeah, you can see it, at some point it doesn't work. So for it to work properly, it has to, you know, you have to tell it that the backwards face is anything pointing in the y direction. And it shouldn't be entirely pointing in the y direction. It should be somewhat pointing, because if we come to our original object here, these faces are pointing straight in the y direction. So even if I put 1 here, it would still work for this one, the backwards face, because this is the backwards side. but for example, this face here is mostly pointing downward. It's still pointing a little bit to the y. It's still pointing a little bit to the y, but very little. So you have to decrease this value here so that it understands that all these faces are the backwards face of the box, basically. And it's the same for the other axes. So for it to be backwards, y has to be greater than, you know, some small value. So it, you know, it should be a little bit pointing into the y direction. And for the front face, it's the same thing. It should be a little bit pointing in that direction. So it should have a y component that's, you know, it doesn't have to be -1, but it has to be you know, close to -1. So what I did is here I said it has to be pointing in -0.1, 0.01 in the minus y direction here. It's the same thing but in reverse basically here. So once you do all this, you get, you know, you get your 3 objects that are properly you know, that are flat. So I have this, which has been a bit unwrapped, and then I had our 2 initial planes here, initial, you know, meshes that you know, sides of the leaf. So once you have all of this that is, you know, properly flat, you can put everything in this node. So this is what I did here. So this is the first, you know, plane of the leaf. Then I plugged in the unwrapped version here of the, you know, the intermediate mesh, and then I plugged in the third, you know, component of our leaf into this socket here. This doesn't have anything. This is just the you know, the temporary view box. It's just to show on the screen what's happening. But those 3 have been, you know, plugged into here. So once everything is plugged into this node, basically this node is going to take all of your objects and make them small enough to fit into here, into the 0, 1 coordinate of the UV unwrapping space. So it's making them small enough, and it's pointing them in the right direction also. So all the faces are basically pointing downwards. And once you have your 3 objects here, you can basically, you know, do whatever you want. I've increased the scale. So I've used one of the transform nodes I've done previously, and I've positioned them correctly onto, you know, the UV space I'm using right now. Just to help me out, I've made this plane, and, you know, I've put the leaf texture on top of it. This is just a simple plane which has nothing to do with the UV unwrapping, with the geometry nodes that I have with the leaf. This is just another object with a leaf texture on top of it. It's just as a, you know, as a reference point to you know, understand where the UV space is for you know, this object once I use the shading tab. So once you have all of your objects here unwrapped and, you know, properly placed, then it's very easy. The next step is just to, you know, on every vertex mark the position, the UV coordinate on every point of the mesh here. So you do this with the store named attribute. You just write whatever name you want here. Just plug in the position in here. Make sure you're on face, corner, and vector. So this vector is going to be used in the shading tab later. So it's going to be able to understand which texture corresponds to which point on your mesh. Then it's very easy. You just have to reassemble your object. So this is what I'm doing here. So with this node, you just put a set position node, and into the position you put your captured attribute from the beginning here, which we captured here. And then once you're done with that, your object will be reconstructed here. Then you can just merge the vertices to make sure everything is connected, you know. Choose a low value so it doesn't distort the mesh. Put your set material here. Put any name you want in here, and it should work as long as it's the same name as in the shading tab here. So where's the name? Oh yeah. Okay, so this is the name. It has to correspond to this name. And the vector that we captured, previously in the set material, so you put the name here and you use the attribute node into, the vector of some image. For example, this is the image I used, so this is the one I'm putting here. This node is the, it's the, why is this not working? This is the image texture node. So here you go and you just select any texture you want, leaf or whatever, and then you plug it in here basically between the the principal BSDF here and the vector attribute node here. So that should work normally if everything goes well. So your object should be reassembled normally, and let's see how it looks. So once you do all of this, it should normally work. So here I have some translucency because it's a leaf, so I've added some translucency, and it seems to be working well. Like, we can see the pattern and stuff. So as I said, if anybody needs those nodes, they can find it on GitHub.